I've spent years trying to forget the sound of his laugh, that tight, sharp little snicker he used whenever he wanted everyone in the room to know who held the power. But I can still hear it, even now. That laugh is the reason I'm telling this story, because it was the moment I realized how cheap dignity can feel when someone decides they're allowed to put a price on it. It started with $170, not a bonus, not a raise, just reimbursement for a hotel and 2 meals during a client trip where the corporate card froze, and I had to cover everything myself. I was making barely enough to stay afloat back then, living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a nail salon where the walls shook every time they fired up the dryers. $170 meant groceries for a week. It meant gas. It meant breathing room. And yet, walking toward Mark's glass office that morning, reimbursement felt like something I had to earn, like a favor I wasn't sure I deserved. He didn't even look up when I stepped in, just held up a finger while finishing whatever dramatic email he was pretending to write. Then, without reading the claim, he pinched the paper between 2 fingers, like it was dirty. "Really?" he said. $170? It's just the hotel and... No, I get it, he cut in. Eyebrows raised, voice loud enough for the team outside to hear. "I just didn't realize we were that tight on cash, buddy. Should we take up a collection?" A few heads turned. A couple smirked. Mark lived for that. The little audience, the moment he could make me feel like I'd walked into the room, already apologizing for existing. "It was a corporate card issue," I said quietly. "I paid out of pocket." Mark leaned back, lacing his hands behind his head, in that CEO in a movie pose he used for every confrontation. "And I'm sure you'll survive," he said. "But if $170 is going to break you, maybe banking isn't your lane." Someone outside let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. He heard it. He loved it. My face went hot, that kind of heat that starts behind your ears and creeps down your neck. But I swallowed it. I needed the job. I needed the medical insurance. I needed the stability. I needed too many things to risk saying what I really wanted to say. "I'll leave the form," I murmured. "You do that," he said, waving me off. "I'll get to it when I can. We have bigger numbers to worry about today." I walked out of his office, hearing that laugh again. Brittle, practiced. The sound of someone who mistakes dominance for competence. And maybe it would have ended there. Maybe I would have gone home, complained to my ceiling, and come back the next day, ready to be stepped on all over again. I was good at that back then. Endurance was my only skill, but humiliation has a way of attaching itself to you, like a burr. It doesn't fall off. It digs deeper every time you take a breath. That afternoon, when the office had thinned out, I checked the reimbursement portal. Mark had denied it. No explanation, no email, no conversation, just denied. That word hit harder than the $170 ever could. It wasn't the money. It was the message. You don't matter enough. For the rest of the week, he treated me like he always had. Small jokes, little digs, reminders that he could pull the floor out from under me anytime he wanted. And I endured it, the way people do when they believe they don't have many options. The way I had always endured it. But something shifted, a quiet thought, a private one. If this is the value they've assigned to me, why am I still here? I didn't act on it immediately. I'd grown up around people who stayed in bad situations out of fear. Fear of being jobless, fear of failing, fear of starting over. I was no different. But a seed had been planted, and once you notice a crack in the foundation, you start to see all the others. Every late night, every stolen weekend, every time Mark took credit for my work, every time he introduced me to clients as the kid who handles the boring stuff. It all added up, one small disrespect at a time. The moment that finally tipped the scale was stupidly mundane. A Tuesday morning stand-up where Mark made another jab about me being tight with money, followed by a smirk toward the team. The room chuckled. A few people avoided my eyes. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, feeling something deep inside me quietly detach. That was the day I realized I wasn't angry. I was done. I didn't tell anyone, didn't make a scene, didn't slam a door. I just went home, updated my resume, and put in applications for roles I wasn't even sure I was qualified for. Anything that looked like a step forward. Anything that wasn't this. 3 weeks later, I walked out of that bank for the last time with a cardboard box that held exactly three things: a plant that never grew, a mug a client once gave me, and the belief, the naive one, that respect was something you could earn by being quiet and useful. I didn't know it yet, but leaving that building was the first brick in the path that would someday lead me to a table where $8.5 billion sat under my signature. And Mark would be the one begging me for a miracle. People like to imagine that once you quit a bad job, the story immediately gets better. It doesn't. There's a strange, empty stretch beforehand. The part where you still hear your old boss's voice in your head, even when he isn't there anymore. I carried Mark's voice with me longer than I'd like to admit. It whispered that I wasn't qualified, that I'd never make more than scraps, that companies could replace me faster than they could refill the printer. The job I landed next wasn't glamorous. A smaller institution, a quieter office, a team that didn't run on caffeine and fear. On my first day, my new manager shook my hand and said, "We're glad to have you." And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. No sarcasm, no slow once-over, no hidden insult, just a simple welcome. I almost didn't trust it. I threw myself into the work. It wasn't exciting, but it was honest. Risk reports, liquidity dashboards, scenario analyses, numbers that didn't lie, and systems that didn't judge. And for the first time in years, I slept without tension in my jaw. Still, the memory of that office, of Mark, lingered like a bruise you forget about until someone presses on it. About 4 months in, I made the mistake of thinking I'd outrun the past. One morning, the department received a list of counterparty exposures for review, and there it was, my old bank. Their name sitting casually among others, a reminder that the world is small and has a cruel sense of humor. My throat tightened. I forced myself to keep reading, telling myself it didn't matter. That part of my life was over, but it wasn't. Not really. That name woke something in me. Not rage, not revenge, just memory. Sharp, inconvenient memory. My new manager asked me to run a stress scenario on that bank's liquidity positions. Routine work, nothing personal. But as I pulled up their statements and filings, irritation crept in, not because of the numbers, but because I could practically hear Mark making another joke, somewhere in that skyscraper, about how I was probably still counting pennies. I shook it off. I had a job to do. And ironically, the deeper I dove into the data, the more I realized the bank I used to work for was anything but stable. Their ratios were tight, too tight. Their short-term funding profile was shallow, and their loan growth looked aggressive in a way that made my stomach twist. I told myself it wasn't my problem, but irritation works like acid. Slow, steady, revealing every flaw beneath the surface. A week later, I was asked to present my findings to the committee. Straightforward numbers, simple conclusions. But the more I spoke, the more obvious it became to everyone in that room. This bank wasn't as strong as it pretended to be. They weren't failing, but they were leaning too far forward, too fast, hoping no one noticed how shaky the ground beneath them was. Someone asked, "Do you think they're a long-term risk?" I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of restraint. I thought of Mark leaning back in his chair, tossing my reimbursement form aside like it was a joke. I thought of the way he made people feel small to make himself look large, and then something clicked inside me. "Yes," I said, "I think they're vulnerable." That single sentence shifted my trajectory, quietly, subtly, but permanently. The months rolled on. I worked late, built models, double-checked assumptions. My name started showing up on project lists I never thought I'd touch. Treasury teams asked for my input. Someone from headquarters emailed me directly to ask about a report I'd built. For the first time in my career, people didn't just tolerate me, they trusted me. One evening, after submitting a complex analysis earlier than expected, my manager stepped into my office. "You ever think about leading a team?" he asked. The question stunned me. Leadership was something other people got. Confident people, loud people, people like Mark who looked born for corner offices. I never pictured myself there, but as he explained the opportunity, my old boss's voice, for the first time, didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like fuel. I said yes. 2 years later, I wasn't the nervous analyst who tiptoed into Mark's office. I was heading risk for the entire region, speaking directly with CFOs and treasurers, building relationships I never imagined I'd have access to. My work started showing up in board packets. Recruiters began calling. I didn't need to chase opportunities anymore. They found me. And then came the offer that would change everything. A senior treasury role at a multinational group worth tens of billions. I read the email twice, then a third time. It felt unreal, like someone had sent it to the wrong person. But it was real, and I accepted. The move was like stepping into another universe. Bigger systems, bigger responsibilities, bigger consequences. I wasn't running reports anymore. I was protecting companies, jobs, supply chains. The numbers were massive, the stakes higher than anything I'd touched. And in the middle of all that complexity, something familiar resurfaced. My old bank's name. Again, this time not as a line item, but as a major counterparty with billions of exposure. I stared at the screen, heartbeat steady, mind strangely calm. I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel triumph, I felt something else, something cleaner, clarity. And then, without warning, the realization hit me with quiet force. This wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. It was just opening its next chapter. I closed the file, knowing I was finally in a position where my decisions could actually move the ground beneath someone else's feet. The first thing you learn in a multinational treasury role is that money never sleeps. It moves, it shifts, it hides, it reveals. Every wire, every liquidity pool, every hedge tells a story if you know how to read it. And when you're responsible for billions, you learn to read fast. My days became a controlled kind of chaos. Dawn calls with Asia, midday meetings with Europe, late afternoon reviews with the Americas. I handled things Mark would have mocked me for even dreaming about. Cross-border cash sweeps, covenant triggers, credit exposures larger than the GDP of small countries. At that level, relationships matter almost as much as ratios. Banks want your deposits the way thirsty men want water. They offer dinners, access, preferential rates. They want to be on your top 3. They want your signature, and my signature now controlled a staggering amount of assets. I didn't let that go to my head. Power isn't intoxicating when you earned it, inch by inch. It's grounding. You remember every insult, every step, every quiet night spent learning instead of sleeping. You remember what it felt like to be dismissed over $172. You remember not to abuse the authority you've been given. But authority still needs to be used. When our team began a full counterparty review, I knew I'd eventually collide with my old bank again. It was inevitable. What I didn't expect was how bad the numbers were once you stripped off the polished surface. Their liquidity coverage, once considered solid, looked inflated by short-term facilities that could vanish in a storm. Their loan book had ballooned too fast, too aggressively, too recklessly. Their derivative positions looked like patchwork, stitched together to cover holes instead of manage risk. I wasn't hunting for flaws. I wasn't digging out of spite. Everything was right there in the filings, bold as daylight. The deeper I went, the quieter the room around me felt. I brought the findings to my director. He listened without interrupting, fingers steepled. "Your recommendation?" he asked. I'd already written it in my head. reduce exposure, unwind positions, reallocate deposits. Not out of vengeance, out of duty. I owed these companies safety, not sentiment. We need to step away, I said simply. He nodded once. Then let's prepare the unwind. Preparation wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic. It was work, detailed, meticulous work. We analyzed maturities, exit costs, collateral requirements. We coordinated with legal, we reviewed contracts, I drafted memos that would ultimately move mountains. Every sentence, every calculation mattered, and through all of it, I kept my emotions locked away. This wasn't personal. It couldn't be personal. But the irony wasn't lost on me. The bank that once scoffed at reimbursing $170 now held over $8 billion of our funds and exposures. $8.5 billion, to be exact. Numbers that could topple reputations, shake markets, trigger regulatory alarms. Numbers that made Mark's smug little smirk feel like a distant artifact from a life I had outgrown. Yet the past has a way of looping back. 2 months into the unwind planning, news broke. A rating agency revised the bank's outlook from stable to negative. Nothing catastrophic yet, but it was the kind of signal professionals don't ignore. Rumors started swirling, tensions in their commercial loan book, internal leadership conflicts, liquidity stress during quarter-end windows. None of it proven, but rumors are like smoke. If you see enough of it, you know there's heat somewhere. Our risk committee convened an emergency session. "We need to accelerate," my director said, looking at me. "Your plan is sound. Let's move the timeline forward." Just like that, theory became action. We began unwinding positions at dawn one Monday, quietly, strategically, with the precision of surgeons. No announcements, no warnings, no theatrics, just clicks, approvals, confirmations. One by one, billions shifted away, deposits transferred, credit lines closed, exposures hedged elsewhere, swaps terminated. I watched the dashboards update. 1.2B moved, then 2.9B, then 5.4B. By late afternoon, the number was 8.5B. $8.5 billion leaving a bank in less than a day is not a small event. It's an earthquake you can't see until the ground is already splitting. Within hours, liquidity alerts triggered at their end. Internal alarms must have been screaming like sirens. Their treasury team would have been scrambling, calling desks, pleading with counterparties, trying to plug holes that were widening faster than they could react. By sunset, the regulators stepped in. It wasn't a shutdown, not yet. But it was the kind of freeze that signals a bank has lost control of its own bloodstream. Trading paused, withdrawals restricted, senior leadership summoned into silence. I stared at the monitor long after the final confirmation. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. If anything, I felt still, like I had been holding my breath for years and finally exhaled. I wasn't happy. I wasn't guilty. I wasn't triumphant. I was resolved. Mark didn't cause this crisis. He wasn't the architect of the bank's recklessness, but he was the embodiment of everything that made toxic leadership dangerous. The arrogance, the blindness, the belief that belittling people was the same as managing them. He taught me a lesson he never meant to teach. When someone shows you what they think you're worth, believe them, but don't let them define you. The following morning, while headlines quietly hinted at liquidity concerns, our CFO called an emergency meeting with the bank's executive team. They requested our presence. They needed to understand the outflow. They needed reassurance. They needed leverage. Any leverage. I went as the representative for our side. I didn't know who would be in the room. I didn't expect to see him again. I definitely didn't expect what happened next. But as I entered the conference room and the door clicked shut behind me, I saw a familiar posture stiffen across the table. Mark, older, thinner, grayer. The swagger was still there, at first. But when he recognized me, something in his expression cracked. He opened his mouth to speak, and that was the moment the story finally, truly turned. He froze in place, as if realizing far too late that the ground he'd once stood on wasn't his anymore. For a long moment, he just stared at me. The same man who once laughed at me over $170 now sat at a polished conference table, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness, tie slightly askew, confidence flickering like a dying bulb. He tried to recover his expression, tried to pull the old smirk back onto his face. But it didn't fit anymore. Not here. Not today. "Wow," he said finally, a half-breath of disbelief. "It's been a while." It had, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging nostalgia where there was none. I took my seat. My director sat beside me. The bank's executives lined the opposite side of the table. Legal counsel, Treasury leads, the COO, and Mark, now a senior VP. He had climbed high, higher than he ever thought I would. And yet here he was, looking at me like I was the one person he couldn't afford to lose. The COO began speaking first, polite but strained, thanking us for coming, emphasizing the long-standing relationship between our organizations, stressing the unexpected severity of market reactions. It was the kind of corporate apology wrapped carefully in neutral language. No admission of fault, just a plea hidden beneath professionalism. Then, inevitably, the spotlight shifted. "We understand most of the withdrawal decisions went through your office," the COO said gently. "We were hoping you could walk us through your reasoning." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't perform. I simply told them the truth. "We stress-tested you," I said. "Your ratios didn't hold. Your liquidity windows didn't hold. Your derivative gaps didn't hold. From a risk standpoint, staying exposed would have been irresponsible." Mark leaned forward, desperation leaking through the cracks. "But pulling everything that fast?" He stopped, breathed, tried again. "You blindsided us." "No," I corrected calmly. "Your balance sheet did." Silence wiped across the room like a cloth over glass. I wasn't there to punish him. I wasn't there for revenge. I was there because our companies had entrusted me with their stability, and I refused to gamble it on a bank pretending not to be on fire. But Mark wasn't thinking about liquidity ratios or stress models. He was thinking about the board breathing down his neck, the regulators circling, the headlines sharpening their teeth. He was thinking about himself, just like always. He turned his chair toward me, the veneer cracking further. "Listen," he said quietly, We can fix this. We just need time. If your group could return even a portion of the deposits, even temporarily, it would stabilize the optics, just long enough to get the regulators off our backs." My director raised an eyebrow, but stayed silent. This was my meeting, after all, my recommendation, my responsibility. Mark wasn't done. "I know things weren't perfect when you worked here," he said, choosing his words with excruciating care. "But that was years ago. Different circumstances, different context. I'm asking you to help us now. Help me." And there it was, the shift in his voice, almost a tremble. He wasn't quite on his knees, but emotionally, he was already there. Pride had slipped through his fingers. What remained was fear. Raw, human fear. For a brief second I saw the young version of myself reflected in his eyes, the one who had stood in his office holding a $170 reimbursement form, wondering why dignity felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. I wasn't that man anymore. "We can't return the funds," I said gently. "Not now. Not under these conditions." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what this will do." "I do," I replied. "That's why we acted." I didn't need to add the rest. If a bank can be undone by the departure of one client's funds, the foundation was flawed long before the withdrawal. He looked down at the table, breathing shallowly. His hands shook once, almost imperceptibly, before he clasped them together to hide it. The COO stepped in, trying to reframe the conversation, but the damage was done. Mark's composure had cracked in front of his own team. The meeting limped to its end, formality carrying it where hope no longer could. Polite thanks. Stiff nods. The COO walked us to the door with a strained smile, but Mark stayed seated, staring at nothing, as if realizing that this moment, this quiet refusal, was the precise point where everything in his world began to tip. I didn't savor it. I didn't enjoy watching him break. What I felt was something simpler. Closure. As we stepped into the hallway, my director murmured, "You handled that well." I just nodded. Later that evening, alone in my apartment, I stood by the window, watching the city lights blink like distant beacons. My phone buzzed with alerts, news outlets speculating about the bank's liquidity freeze, analysts dissecting the outflow. Not one of them knew my name. That anonymity felt like peace. People assume satisfaction comes from revenge, from seeing the person who hurt you suffer. But that's never been the true reward. The real victory is no longer carrying their voice in your head, no longer shrinking yourself to fit their expectations, no longer waiting for someone else to decide your worth. I made dinner, I washed the dishes, I folded laundry. Life moved in quiet, steady rhythms I had built for myself, without humiliation, without fear. A week later, a message from an old coworker popped up. "Did you hear what happened to Mark?" I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The universe had already given me the only answer I ever wanted. Freedom from the weight he once held over me. I stepped out onto my balcony with a cup of coffee, breathing in the cool air. The city felt wide, open mine. People like to say everything comes full circle, but circles imply you end where you began. I didn't. I ended somewhere better. Not above him, not ahead of him, just beyond him entirely. For the first time in my life, the silence around me finally felt like something I had earned.